The still life I've set up for this lesson has a few different materials in it. We have a glass bottle with some red sand inside, a wooden box, a blue marble, and a block shaped like a house. The goal of this lesson is to really look at these objects and to interpret what you're seeing and to distill them down into what makes them that particular object. What makes it feel like a shiny marble? What makes glass look and feel transparent? Drawing isn't just about copying your object. It's also about drawing the feel and the essence of the object. In lesson 5, we're going to be using the 18 by 24 inch sketch paper. I'm going to use a Nitram charcoal stick in HB. I'm going to use the HB charcoal pencil. I have a General's charcoal pencil. We're going to use white charcoal pencils. I have a Primo Bianco, but you could use whatever white charcoal pencil you have. I'm going to use a stick eraser. I'm going to be using a kneaded eraser, and I'm also going to be using a soft mop watercolor paintbrush to wipe away debris. Any soft brush will work for what we're doing. I'm going to begin my drawing with an envelope. Remember, the envelope is just a loose sketch, essentially, of the outside contours of your still life. Now I'm going to block in all of my objects. What I try to do with the block in is to get everything where I want it on my paper. The right size, basically the right shape. It's the scaffold for your entire drawing. We will be refining and adjusting all of the objects later, but still take your time now to look at all the objects in the still life. Compare their sizes and their placements. Think about how things are touching each other and how big or small they are in relation to each other. So, for instance, think about how tall the marble is compared to the box, and think about where it sits in relation to the front of the box. Compare the height of the box to the height of the glass bottle. Try to reflect all of this in your block-in sketch. This is where I'm really looking at the still life and trying to compare angles and shapes and refine each thing on my paper. I visually measure everything, meaning that I don't use a ruler or any other sort of measuring tool. My goal is to draw what I see freehand and to have my drawings reflect that, so they aren't intended to be photorealistic. I'm using my charcoal pencil to compare the sides of the box, the top of the box. They should be parallel. My goal is to make them parallel. I prefer art where the hand of the artist shows through, so I welcome that in my drawings. I try for accuracy, but not perfection. The block-in is your chance to get all the objects to where you want them in regards to accuracy. So keep refining your block-in until you're happy with the sizes, shapes, and placement of everything you're drawing. Now we are going to work on each object individually. So this lesson is really about observing and looking. And by that I mean when I'm drawing objects, I look for things about them that I can use to translate what they are in three-dimensional space to two-dimensional space and make them look like that thing. So we want this to look like it's made out of glass, to be transparent. I don't want it to be dark. I want it to feel like it's clear, that you can see through it. So how do I do that? What about that object makes it glass? For me, it's a few things. I look for the darkest spots on the glass. I look for the heaviest parts. And I look for the brightest spots. And I'm going to draw this as lightly and as indistinctly as possible, but still make it look as though it has presence, that it's something you could hold. So the first thing I try to notice is the thickness of the walls. And I've put sand in this glass so you can see it a little easier, because the sand doesn't touch the outside of the glass at all, it touches the inside. So the glass has dimension, it has walls. So by pulling that sand in a bit to the edge of the wall and maybe giving it a little indication of the wall, I'm going to start to make it look like it has dimension. The other thing it has is a very heavy base. And the sand also does not go to the base of the glass, it goes to the bottom of the inside. And that base is thick and heavy. So I'm going to give an indication of that heaviness. So I'm finding places where I can add information. Just enough information to make it look like it has presence, but not so much that it looks solid in regards to being opaque. Right now I'm not concerned about the highlights, the brightest spots that much. We'll work with those a little bit later. What I'm really looking at to get the drawing the way I want is the darkest parts of the glass and the physical shape of the bottle. It would be easy to overwork this because there's a lot of tone on the glass. I can see a lot of gray, there are a lot of light and dark passages. But what I'm trying to do right now is just find the very darkest passages. I'm also going to kind of take away some of the exterior bits where the glass sort of melds into the background and just let it fade away. I want it to feel light and airy. I don't want it to be heavy. Now I'm going to work on the sand a bit. The sand, unlike the glass, is very solid and opaque, and I want to get that feeling of denseness, of solidness. So I'm going to just start by toning it in, just kind of an overall even tone. I think it might be difficult to tell the world that this is sand, so my goal is going to be to tell a viewer that there's something inside this bottle and that something is dense, but it's able to have a tilt to it and to maintain a tilt, so it's not a liquid. And I hopefully can give a feel of sort of something sand-like. One interesting thing about the sand to me is that you can see the front of it and you can see the back of it, because we're looking into the glass and over the top of the sand to the back of the glass. The sand inside the glass also has a darker side as it turns away from the light. So I'm going to tone that in and to give it some shape. Again, I'm trying to stay away from the side of the glass because the sand doesn't extend to the outside of our glass walls. Now I'm going to work a little bit on the bottle as it goes over the sand. I want the bottle to feel like it has presence. I want it to feel like it has dimension over the sand. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm first going to lighten this up. You can see down here that the sand has a reflection at the bottom. So I'm going to add that just by working over the sand, pulling information off of it. It also has this really bright white highlight that goes all the way up the bottle. It's not super white, but it follows the shape of the bottle, and it pulls right over the sand. So I'm just going to literally pull that tone off with my stick eraser. I'm trying to create the illusion of that subtle highlight, but I also notice that I can see the lighter areas, and the highlight doesn't stay consistent in color or in shape as it goes up the bottle. It's reflecting the box, it's reflecting all the lights that are on it. It has some brighter spots, which I'm going to pull out. So what I'm trying to do is really observe what I'm seeing in the still life and to mimic that as best I can, because that's what's going to make this object read as glass. So the brilliant highlights and the dark areas on the glass are what really indicate glass to me. So that's what I'm focusing on. It's really easy to overwork glass, so I try to create the feeling and the essence of glass with as little line work and as little toning as possible. So unlike the glass, this little house is very solid. It's made out of wood. It has these interesting wood grain patterns on it. So I want this to feel very solid, whereas this feels very translucent. The first thing I'm going to do with it, because I like the wood grain, is to put that pattern in here. And then later, I'm going to tone over the pattern. So I'm looking at the stripes, essentially, as I'm doing this, and how they're not totally consistent. They're not just stripes. They have a thicker and a thinner area. Some are wide, some are very thin. They are wood grain. So I want to try and convey that. That's what says wood to me. I'm looking at each one, trying to draw them. They don't have to be perfect, but I still want it to feel like a wood grain pattern. I'm also noticing here that the pattern attaches to the roof, essentially. So each of these stripes turn and then go down the roof. So I'm going to purposefully and consciously follow that pattern. And here they turn and go down the side of the house. So again, I'm just going to continue that pattern on down the side of the house. Now that I have the pattern on the house, I'm going to add the tone and the shadows. I'm going to just work right over the top of the pattern I created. I don't want the pattern to sit on top of the tone. I want it to be part of the tone and part of the shadows. So I'm going to just shade right over the top of it. While I'm drawing, I'm looking at the color of the house, which is lighter than the color of the sand. So my goal is to create a house that has some nice tone on it, but it's lighter in tone than the sand. I'm going to work back and forth a little bit with my charcoal pencil and the stick eraser to put charcoal on and take it off to get it to the color that I want it to be, essentially. I'm also going to bring some of the pattern back in just a little bit by just redrawing the pattern or the stripes back onto the house. Now I'm going to work on the marble. The marble, like the house, is very solid, but like the glass, it's very shiny. It has these brilliant white highlights. So it has some characteristics of the glass, but it also has characteristics of the solidness of the house. So what I'm going to look for first are the dark and light areas of the marble and the highlights. But first I'm just going to try and give it a solid tone, kind of to make it feel dense. My goal is to try to make this look like a shiny object, and because we are familiar with marbles, hopefully it will read like a marble when we're done with it. I'm not thinking about the light areas yet. I'm thinking and working on the dark areas. I'm going to pull the light areas in a moment. I also want this to look very smooth. I don't want it to have texture. Now I'm going to work back and forth a little, bringing some of that dark tone in and smoothing it, working between the charcoal pencil and the stick eraser. The stick eraser erases, but it also moves the charcoal around. If I were to press hard on this, I could pull tone completely off, but if I press lightly, I can just move the charcoal around on the marble and smooth it. So now I'm working a little bit harder with the stick eraser to actually pull a bit of tone off to lighten parts of the marble. Now I'm going to bring in the white charcoal. This is a Primo charcoal pencil, and really put the bright highlights in. I'm drawing right over the black black charcoal. I'm also going to use this to make the tone look a little more milky. So I'm kind of just drawing white charcoal right over the black and toning it in an all over sort of way just to create it more of a milky feel. Now I'm going to work to give it more of a shine, I hope, and more of a feel of a marble. I'm looking at the dark areas and the light areas, and I'm working back and forth with the black and the white charcoal and the stick eraser. All right, that's as far as I'm going to take this little marble. I want it to be distinct. I want it to look and feel as round as possible. And I want it to have a feel and an essence of density and smoothness that says marble. And it's different from everything else that I've drawn on the paper so far. Now I'm going to work on the wooden box. I want to convey what makes it look like a handmade wooden box. And for me, it's these dovetail joints. It's this line down here, which is the lid, actually. And what I notice about the dovetail joints is that some of them are darker than others because they're showing the grain of the wood. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to draw the ones that look the darkest to me, and I'm just going to draw some of them lightly in. I'm also looking at the fact that they follow the perspective of the box. So I'm going to make sure that I keep the dovetail joint in perspective. To help me draw the joints the same size, I lightly draw a guideline to delineate how wide the joints are and then draw them accordingly. And then I just erase the guideline when I'm done using it. I'm going to tone a couple of them in really lightly just to give them a little bit of presence and a little bit of form. I'm looking at the object itself to really see which ones look the darkest. The other corners have dovetail joints as well, so I'm going to put the same information on these corners. I know that each corner will have the same number of dovetail joints and that all of them are the same size. So these are the things I'm focusing on in order to draw these in. Now I'm going to put a little bit of this information down here that runs along the bottom. This is actually the lid. The box is upside down, but I want to put this information in just to make it more interesting. I'm going to stick with the wooden box just a little bit. I'm not going to tone it very much because it's a very light object. Of the 4 objects we have here, it's the lightest, not including the clear glass. But I want it to be 3-dimensional. I want to indicate that this side is in shadow, so I'm going to lightly tone this side of the box with my charcoal pencil. I'm using the charcoal pencil because I want the shading I do on the box to have a bit of texture. I'm trying to pay attention to where the box is the darkest. So I see a kind of a dark area where the top and the side meet. I'm trying to keep the joints a little distinct. And I see a reflected image of the marble, just a little hint of it. So I'll be toning that in. I'm really looking for this kind of information to give the box a 3-dimensional feel and to make it look like a handmade box. Now I'm going to look and work on the top just a little. I'm not working on the shadow of the bottle yet, the cast shadow. I'm just looking at the top of the box and the tone of the top of the box. I'm going to shade the box right through the bottle's cast shadow. Now I'm going to work on the cast shadows. I'm going to look and see in the still life where the shadows feel the darkest. As they come down and move away from the objects, they get a little bit lighter. They also have some reflected light bouncing into them from the tabletop. Where the objects touch is the darkest part of the shadow. Even though this is a very hard edge shadow, at the very edge of it, it still softens a bit to a little bit of an amorphous fuzziness, which I like to add. It gives it a feeling of being in space, of existing in space. And then I'll add that essentially by taking away tone from the edges of the shadow. I'm going to tone in the shadow of the glass bottle right over the top of the tone I've already put on the wooden box. The glass bottle actually leaves a bit of reflected light behind it, which is another thing I want to add. So I'm going to pull that out with my stick eraser. It's not as big as I'm going to erase it essentially right now, but I'm going to pull it out, pull some tone out, and then add tone back in to create this reflected light effect. Again, it's just a back and forth of pulling tone off and putting tone back on to get to the point where you were happy with the effect. The last thing I'm going to look at with this is the shadow on the tabletop that the box creates, and I'm going to just tone that in as well. The last thing I'm going to do on this drawing is to give it a little bit of atmosphere. So I have a little tiny bit of table edge here. I can see the table here and I can see the table back here. And I just want to give it a little bit of feeling of depth. So I'm going to add the tiniest bit of tone. This tone doesn't exist in my still life. My table is actually not pushed up against the wall behind it. But I'm just going to give the drawing the tiniest bit of information to look like our still life sits next to a wall, or maybe as if it sits on the floor next to a wall. By giving it this tiniest bit of information, I can make the still life sit in a corner. So you can do a lot with just adding a little bit of information to change the atmosphere or the location, essentially, of your still life. So this lesson is about observing, essentially, and really looking at your objects and figuring out what about them, what aspects of them make them that thing.